If the children, kindergarten through 5th grade, want to join in back, Mike and Vicki will be taking you down to junior worship, so if you want to head toward the back. And if everybody wants to be turning to John chapter 6, you're welcome to do that. Portions of it will be on the TV back here. I'm going to read again, beginning in verse 35, and what I have to share this morning will be short because I want to allow enough time for Elizabeth to share with us as well. But beginning in verse 35, it says, Jesus said to them, I am the bread of life. He who comes to me will not hunger, and he who believes in me will never thirst. But I said to you that you have seen me and yet do not believe. All that the Father gives me will come to me, and the one who comes to me I will certainly not cast out. For I have come down from heaven, not to do my own will, but the will of him who sent me. This is the will of him who sent me, that of all that he has given me I lose nothing, but raise it up on the last day. For this is the will of my Father, that everyone who beholds the Son and believes in him will have eternal life, and I myself will raise him up on the last day. Therefore, so Jesus shares these thoughts that we just contemplated a few moments ago, before we shared together in the meal to remember, to proclaim, to examine all of those things. Those few words that we thought about, Jesus had just said to the group that was there before him. And even Jesus, even in the midst of that, said, you've seen me and yet you don't believe. Well, it becomes very obvious in verse 41, therefore the Jews were grumbling about him because he said, I am the bread that came down out of heaven. Now, they really don't, and it's very interesting because they don't key up on the idea of bread at all. It was the come down out of heaven part that stuck in their craw. It was that Jesus said. If we read on, in verse 42, they were saying, is not this Jesus, the son of Joseph, whose father and mother we know? How does he now say, I have come down out of heaven? Jesus answered and said to them, I love it when Jesus, whether somebody is saying something against him or they're just thinking something against him, responds to them. And it doesn't say that they were saying this to Jesus, but Jesus is saying it to them. But they're grumbling and they're saying, isn't this the Jesus that is Joseph's son? We know his father and mother. We know, how can he say he came down out of heaven? And Jesus answered and said to them, do not grumble among yourselves. No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him, and I will raise him up on the last day. It is written in the prophets, verse 45, and they shall all be taught of God. Everyone who has heard and learned from the Father comes to me. Not that anyone has seen the Father, except the one who is from God. He has seen the Father. Truly, truly, I say to you, he who believes has eternal life. I am the bread of life. Your fathers ate the manna in the wilderness, and they died. This is the bread which comes down out of heaven, so that one may eat of it and not die. I am the living bread that came down out of heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. And the bread also, which I will give for the life of the world, is my flesh. I mean, Jesus begins to make it extremely clear. I mean, when he says, I am the bread of life, of course that he's speaking figuratively. But he addresses it with a familiarity that we understand we need to eat. That we need to take food into our bodies to sustain us. And they're very familiar with that. And Jesus is saying, that is who I am. To be sustained, to live, you're going to have to take me within yourself. Because, I mean, at the close of what he's saying there in verse 51, he says, and the bread also which I will give for the life of the world is my flesh. That's the reason when Jesus during that Passover with those who did believe him. They did believe in him and they believed him. But he took that bread and he said, "This is my body." So that we would have something that we could connect together, that we can make that connection, whether it's a tiny piece or it's a loaf, whether we tear it apart and hand it to each other as Jesus and the disciples did in that upper room, or whether we pick it up out of a plate, that we are recognizing that Jesus is sustaining us. He is giving us life. He is the bread that came down out of heaven. When they thought of bread coming down out of heaven, immediately they would think of manna, right? I mean, what other bread came down out of heaven? And that was God providing for them, ironically, when they were grumbling. And God provided for them, those Israelites that were in the wilderness, they were needing to eat, but God is providing for the entire world, for those who will choose to believe in Jesus, from a bread that comes down out of heaven, and it's not the manna. Because Jesus says, those who ate the manna still died. Even the resurrection, Jesus, even right before he raised Lazarus, said to Mary and Martha, "I am the resurrection and the life." But what happened even to those people like Lazarus, and then later on to even when Jesus had ascended, to Tabitha, who was called Dorcas when Peter raised her, or all of those that we see that happening. I mean, the widow's son when they were coming out, and all of those that were raised, they died again physically. They are not alive today. But there is a resurrection and a life coming that comes because of the bread of life. That bread will sustain, and that's what Jesus is pointing to. It's not like the manna, in which the ones who ate of it and were sustained in the wilderness still died. In verse 52, then the Jews began to argue with one another, saying, "How can this man give us his flesh to eat?" We're that way sometimes. Or if we're not that way, we know somebody who is reacting that way. I mean, do you suppose that they were that thick that they really didn't understand Jesus was speaking figuratively? Or were they, I mean, just because so many of Jesus' words were so different from anything that anybody else was saying, maybe it took a little time to sink in. But he said, the bread that I'm going to give is my flesh. And that was their response. And maybe they were trying to figure it out. What is he saying? But they didn't like him. And because they didn't like him, anything that they could find, way that they could twist, any way that they could bring it out that this guy is being foolish. What is he saying? I mean, how's he going to provide his flesh? So Jesus said to them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in yourself. He who eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise him up on the last day." How many have read this before? How many have heard this before? All right. This is kind of familiar to us, right? This was not familiar to them. I suppose that even those who were believing, those disciples, Jesus is saying this, and all of a sudden, I mean, he is just so very straightforward with it. Unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you cannot have eternal life. Unless you eat my flesh and you drink my blood, you will die eternally. For my flesh is true food, verse 55, and my blood is true drink. He who eats my flesh and drinks my blood abides in me, and I in him. As the living Father sent me, and I live because of the Father, so he who eats me, he also will live because of me. This is the bread which came down out of heaven, not as the fathers ate and died. He who eats this bread will live forever. You've heard that phrase, you are what you eat. There are things that we really enjoy to eat. And there are even times when you may have something you really enjoy to eat, but you really don't want to eat, but you know you need to eat. There are times that we don't want to do what Jesus is telling us to do. I think it's interesting in this context of Jesus talking that he said, I came down here not by my own will, but the will of my Father. It's interesting how Jesus mentions that from time to time, and one was in the Garden of Gethsemane. And Jesus referred to that moment as a cup that he was to drink. And he didn't want to drink it. If there's another way, let this cup pass from me. There are times that we just don't want to eat. But if we know what gives us life, we will eat. We will drink. And we will live. That's what he does for us. We're going to have an invitation song. An opportunity for anyone who needs prayer, anyone who needs to give their life to Christ, anyone who needs to share. It's an opportunity. So if you need to come during that time, I invite you. Please come. We're going to stand and sing together.